Fans of classic-style shoot-em-ups, or shmups, actually have a lot of options today. Sure, the glory days of shooter overload on the Genesis and the TurboGrafx may be over, but between a nice library of ports of obscure old ones, some classics getting the remastered treatment, and a respectable selection of new games in the genre, there's still plenty to choose from. And as a 30-something-year-old fan of the genre myself, I'm pretty satisfied with the genre right now. So here I'm gonna talk about some of the shoot-em-ups that I've come across since getting a PS5. And keep in mind, I don't think any of these are exclusive to the PlayStation Network, so if you don't have a PS5, odds are you can play them somewhere else. Takotan is a shooter that I don't think I would have ever played if I didn't notice it on sale on PSN. It honestly looks kind of dumb, but much to my surprise, it actually became one of my favorite modern shooters I've played. It's certainly in that more cute-em-up subgenre of shooters, but I think there's always room for more of that. Airzonk is one of my favorite games of all time, after all, and Takotan actually kind of reminds me of Airzonk in a few ways. You play, of course, Takotan, a flying octopus thing, and you're saving the world for some reason. The game has a sense of humor and style about it that I like a lot, and it keeps the game from getting boring or taking itself too seriously. But more importantly, it's really well balanced out, with decent but not crushing challenge that scales up fairly evenly throughout the game, even though it never quite gets into what I would call difficult. You can definitely beat it in one sitting, but perhaps not without working at it a little bit. Takotan's shape can make navigating around busier sections feel a little bit unwieldy, but his dodge maneuver, where he hops into the background for a second, mostly bridges that gap. Some of the weapons are better than others, but I definitely give credit for the attempts at uniqueness. I think I actually prefer the yo-yo of all things. While you're shooting enemies and avoiding fire, you can also collect little jewels for extra points, and shooting them will change their color as well as the amount of points they're worth, kinda like how the bells work in the Twin B games. Takotan's got a good variety of levels and enemies, fun boss fights, except for a couple of them that are maybe a little too easy, and a great bouncy little soundtrack that might not stay stuck in your head after you shut off the game, but it definitely sells the vibe well while you're playing it. Overall, I definitely recommend this one. If you like shooters like Ordyne or Airzonk or even Twin B, definitely give this one a shot. I didn't really have any experience with Neo Geo back in the 90s, and I really don't have that much with it even now. But now I know how many great SNK shooters that I've missed, including the original Andro Dunos, or Dunos. But apparently 20 years later, we got a sequel on modern systems, and it definitely makes a point to retain all the classic visuals, music style, and the hard-as-nails shoot-em-up gameplay. Not for the faint of heart. This also is one of the most authentic retro-style games I've ever played in general. You could have told me this was a port from Super Nintendo or something and I probably would have believed you. Enemies are creative, levels are well designed with lots of variety, and the music is pretty good, if not a little bit derivative perhaps. But there's no doubt that if you're a fan of classic shmups, especially the more difficult ones, this is one to get. It starts handing your ass to you pretty thoroughly after the first couple of levels. I personally haven't managed to beat it yet, but I'll keep coming back to it until I do, because it's the kind of challenge that really entices you to keep trying rather than making you want to quit. Gleylancer is kinda like if Image Fight from the PC Engine had a baby with Thunder Force 4, or as we know it in the West, Lightning Force. Gleylancer is on the PS4 and 5, and is a really nice port of the original Sega Mega Drive game, but has a lot of nice new features like save states, real-time rewind, and several heavily customizable display options, like screen curvature and CRT gamma, on top of usual aspect ratio and scanline stuff that you usually see. They do thankfully have a perfect integer scaled option if you want it to be as authentic as possible, as well as a standard 4x3 and a horrible 16x9 that stretches out the image that you can use if you're an insane person. This is a shooter from 1992 that you don't hear much about these days, but that's not because it's bad. This is actually a rather excellent example of the genre at its best, with great music, several different weapons that aren't quite as different as I would like, but they are there, pretty intense challenge, a little bit of a story, and good level variety. This is one of those shooters that really isn't as much about the weapon that you have selected as much as it is about the type of satellite you're using. You got the type that shoots in the direction you're shooting in, the type that shoots in the direction you're going away from, and even a couple different types that loosely seek out enemies in your immediate vicinity. And that's the part that kind of reminds me of Image Fight, although unlike that game, you can actually select from these in real time, which makes it a lot easier. It doesn't knock any one thing totally out of the park, but it does enough things right that I can recommend it pretty easily. Natsuki Chronicles kind of tries to bring the genre into the modern era a little bit, and I really appreciate that. The game has a pretty fleshed out story, modern visuals with some depth to them, multiple progression systems, and upgradable weaponry and abilities. The only downside is that none of these things are done particularly well. Don't get me wrong, it's a very good game, and certainly beats the hell out of games like Rigid Force, which we'll talk about later, but it's not super compelling either. The story, the music, the visuals, while totally fine, are also pretty generic and forgettable, and just don't stand out to me very much in any way. Also, the menu screens are just so plain, it's almost clinical. Like, look at this level select screen. It just feels like I'm in a doctor's office or something. Still, I enjoy playing the game, and it's got some cool ideas. Like, for instance, these little indicators on the screen that let you know from what direction an enemy is about to emerge. Although they probably wouldn't have felt the need to do that had they made the backgrounds contrast with the foreground a little bit better. But still, it's a nice touch, and really emblematic of the effort this game makes to introduce more modern ideas into such an old genre that hasn't really changed much in 3-4 decades. Having different difficulty settings for each level adds a little bit more replayability to them as well, and I found the different upgrades for the weapons to be pretty fun to experiment with, although there's really nothing here that you haven't seen before. Depending on how much this kind of thing interests you, maybe wait on a sale, but I do recommend playing it at some point. This one is a pretty goofy shooter with a lot of weird characters and level designs, and I really do like it for that, although I could understand why some might not. Kyo Blaster is very much its own thing in the genre, and despite being a pretty short and clearly low-budget game, I can recommend it to those of us that don't mind a little bit of jank in exchange for some creative fun. I do think that more hardcore players might get frustrated with its wonky combat, enemies that don't telegraph their attacks very well, and the admittedly hideously low frame rate. Seriously, why this doesn't run at a smooth 60 frames per second minimum is beyond me, but still, the weird presentation, the unique characters, the unconventional weapons, all that stuff does make it stand out enough that I think people who really enjoy the genre would get a kick out of it, if for nothing else than to just see something a little weird and different and maybe get a few laughs. I mean, come on, I'm playing as a severed dog head. Can't say I've ever done that before. Speaking of things that are a little bit different, Rigid Force Redux is pretty much the opposite of that. The game oozes generic shmup concepts in pretty much every possible area. It certainly lures you in with some R-Type inspired elements like the level layouts and of course the launchable pod that can help you shoot things at different angles and whatnot, and I'd even go so far as to say it's pretty well made overall, with solid performance and tightly paced out levels. But all of that doesn't quite make up for it being as generic and uninspired as it is, and I hate saying generic and uninspired because those phrases are in and of themselves incredibly generic and uninspired. But that's just what this game is. I mean, that's just how I would describe it. Of course, it's not a bad game, the shooting feels fine, the graphics are decent, it just creates a low ceiling for itself by doing so little with any of its elements. Weapons, enemies, music, and even the story that they did go through the effort of putting in here are all very forgettable. I can certainly recommend it to shooter hounds who really like digging into everything the genre has to offer, but only with the understanding that it's just not going to impress you with just about anything it does. It's above average, I suppose, but not by much. Crisis Wing is a lot like Andro Dunos 2, in that it's technically a modern game, but could easily fool you into thinking it's from the Mega Drive or the Super Nintendo. I really like the enemies here, as they all have really imposing and very detailed designs sometimes. Their firing patterns are all pretty similar though, which is a little bit of a shame. The levels are also pretty cool looking, but not so sensational as to distract from the foreground. The gameplay is tough. and it doesn't wait long at all to start handing your ass to you. The difficulty doesn't feel quite as earned as it does in other better shooters though, because your ship's default speed here is very slow, and apparently can't be changed, while your weapons, even when upgraded, are pretty mediocre and boring. Now I don't mind a shoot 'em up having only one default speed for your ship necessarily, but it needs to be faster than this. However, I do mind the weapons being as similar as they are here. The green and the red are both just kind of different types of spread shot, while the blue just adds some missiles. And there's really no reason to choose one over the other in any situation that I encountered, so like I said, it sort of makes the difficulty feel weird because it sort of feels like it was originally sort of an average difficulty game, but they just purposefully made you weaker and less maneuverable to make it artificially harder. Of course, I don't know if that's what it is, it just feels like that. Also, the biggest red flag here is that I ran into an issue a few times where the enemies would just randomly become invincible and I couldn't pick up score items. Rebooting the game seems to fix it, but it's happened to me more than once, and that just kind of feels inexcusable, especially in a game that doesn't let you save your progress and forces you to restart every time you play it. Crisis Wing definitely does some things right, like a 2-player mode, a boss rush, practice mode, time attack modes, as well as a bunch of display options including horizontal tape mode, but it's tough to give too much credit for that when it could just stop working for no reason and force you to restart. And that's a really big shame because out of all of these, this one reminded me the most of games like Soldier Blade and Truxton, which are, in my opinion, up there at the top of the pile when it comes to shoot 'em ups. Null Drifter is kind of amazing in how addicting and fun it is, despite being one of the simplest, most bare-bones shoot-em-ups I've ever played. It's kinda like a roguelike in a way, as it's meant to be tried and retried many times while you earn money to upgrade your ship in between runs. The two-tone color scheme is pretty harsh on the eyes, but if you turn off the chromatic aberration, that helps a lot, makes your eyes want to explode a little bit less. Also, as you play and get further, you'll unlock more and more color schemes, and I recommend sticking with the darker ones. This controls like every other twin-stick shooter you've played. Left stick moves, right stick shoots. And you can dash to get through lines of fire or do substantial damage to enemies if you dash right through them. And that's a pretty risky maneuver though. The enemies of course get harder and harder to kill, and they dish out more and more bullets as it goes along. And eventually the screen just kind of erupts into an outrageous mishmash of nonsense that you just end up losing control of. So in that way it kind of reminds me of old Atari shooters like Spider Fighter and stuff that you were never really meant to beat, just replay endlessly as you chase down high scores. And the simplistic nature of all of that does mean that it's probably best played in short bursts. But those bursts are always a good time, and that's what matters. It's also only one of several East Asia soft games that play like this, so if you dig it, check out their other twin-stick shooters. They've got several on the PS5 that play like this. So, as you can see, the idea that the shmup genre is dead is just wrong. Now, we could certainly be doing better. For instance, not everything needs to be a retro throwback. We already have countless retro shooters out there, and so far, nobody has really outdone the classics. So I encourage developers to really do their own thing with the genre a little bit more, even if it means risking being an oddball weirdo game that nobody plays like Q-Yo Blaster. At least that game takes a stab at whatever it is. I also think games like Natsuki Chronicles and Rigid Force have the right idea by trying to bring the genre into the present a little bit, with more story and more things to upgrade and work towards. They don't really nail those things yet, but I think they're on the right track. Let me know what shooters you like best in the comments below and I'll try them out. But until then, thanks for watching.